Yeah, let's get after it. We are in Mark, the end of chapter 10 today, and then into chapter 11. Familiar story. We'll end with I think, what will be a familiar story. The first story may or may not be familiar. Michael, one of the things I both appreciate and sometimes scratch my head at in regards to the Gospel of Mark is Mark. It seems like very rarely does Mark just tell us a story and it's just a story. Mark has a way of putting a little twist in it that makes you sort of wonder what's happening. And I think that's true here today as Jesus encounters a blind man. So chapter 46, verse 46 of chapter 10. They came to Jericho. As he and the disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, the son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out, saying, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man and said, "Take heart, get up, he's calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and he came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And the blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." And immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. So in many ways, this would be a very typical healing story. Jesus is confronted by a man who has a need. The man calls out, "Jesus, son of David," which is a messianic term, a term pointing toward the Messiah. It could be more generic, but in this context, it may even indicate that the man is making a statement of faith. The people tell him to be quiet, which might play against Mark's other themes a little bit. But then there's this moment where Jesus calls him and says, "Bring him here." And the man comes to him. And then Jesus, who knows people's motives, who knows the situation, who always knows more than everyone around him, says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And it is a curious mechanism of the story that Jesus would ask this man, "What do you want me to do for you?" And, many people have tried to understand what's at stake here. Is Mark trying to show us that Jesus never heals against people's will? Is he waiting so that Jesus can put, that Mark can put the man's request in words, "My teacher, let me see again"? What is exactly happening that this man would need to be asked for his request? And, I don't know. I mean, clearly that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is, again, that Jesus heals blindness, that this man couldn't see, and yet he still knew things that people who can see did not. And he gets an encounter with Jesus, and he leaves changed. But it is, I think, Michael, an interesting way to tell a story.
It is, and I'm just going to add another layer to it, Clint. The names of the story, I think, are really interesting. The names and the addresses. This is one of the things that I think we read by quickly when we read the Bible. Oftentimes, we maybe get a little self-conscious that we can't pronounce a name or these kinds of things, especially in the Old Testament, and we're quick to read by these things. But I want to point out here in verse 46, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. And Bible scholars, I don't think, know exactly what Timaeus is supposed to mean for us. My commentary here says that it could be a reference to Plato's writing called Timaeus. It could also be a wordplay on the Aramaic word for unclean and the Greek word for highly prized. It could be those things. It could be another thing. But I think a thing that Mark does, to your point, Clint, is Mark doesn't include these details haphazardly. When Mark gives a name or an address, when this man says, "Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me," there's likely a reason why this story with the address that this man gives to Jesus, son of David, gets included at this point in the story. I'm speculating, but it would be reasonable as Jesus approaches the city of David that he's going to get addressed as the son of David. Is it that or something else? But I think as we come through the story, we discover that there's different addresses and names given, and these often have some kind of significance. And once again, this man addresses Jesus as son of David, verse 47, verse 48. But look down, when he addresses Jesus directly again, he says in verse 51, my teacher, let me see again. It's fascinating. To what extent is son of David a profession of faith? Or to what extent is that some other sort of kind of more political address of Jesus? Because the name teacher has been given way back early in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus was called teacher by the Pharisees, I think, right away. So here, what's happening here is this man's blindness in sight. Is there some sense in which that's spiritual? And these addresses are helping show us that. Once again, I'm sorry. I'm asking a lot of rhetorical questions because I don't have answers. But this is one of the things that jumps out to me as I see the story.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you have the son of Timaeus encountering the son, or even proclaiming the son of David, who is, to the reader, the Son of God. And you have the tie-in of the language there. And you may know this, but bar in Aramaic or... in Aramaic, in Greek, it functions in Greek, but it's really in Aramaic, means the son of. So one has a bar mitzvah and not a bat mitzvah. Bat would be daughter, bar would be son. So boys have bar mitzvahs. So bar Timaeus, it literally in the language says the son of Timaeus. And maybe Mark doesn't know if his readers would know that. If he's writing to Gentiles, maybe it seems like not a detail he would need to provide for them. But it is an interesting way to tell the story. What do you want me to do for you? So Jesus here gives this man an invitation, and this man speaks to what he understands to be his deepest need. My teacher, let me see again. And possibly we imply that he has lost his sight rather than being born blind, the idea that he's being restored, that he used to at some point be able to see. And then Jesus says what Jesus often says, go, your faith has made you well, which on one hand, no, Jesus made him well. But on the other hand, Jesus always gives credit for his healing work to some extent to the belief of the people who stand before him. And I shouldn't say always. He often does, and he does here. We've seen that many times in Mark. Your faith has made you well. The idea that this man's belief that Jesus could heal him, if not contributed to the healing, certainly occasioned it. And Jesus always celebrates faith when he sees it, and he sees it in this blind man, ironically enough. And so he immediately, we see this word all the time in Mark, he regained his sight and followed him on the way. The next story we get, we're in Jericho in this healing story, which, by the way, is the last healing story, my Bible says, in the Gospel of Mark. And then we move to Jerusalem. So we're about 20 miles distance from Jericho to Jerusalem. And this story, as we begin chapter 11, is one that you've known, you've heard. This is Mark's version of Palm Sunday. And as typical of Mark, it is probably the simplest version of it. Just 10 or 11 verses. So let me read this for you, and then we'll talk about it a little bit. When they were approaching Jerusalem at Bethphage and Bethany near the Mount of Olives, Jesus sent two of the disciples, and he said to them, go into the village ahead of you, and immediately as you enter, you will find there a colt that has never been ridden. Untie it and bring it to me. If anyone says to you, what are you doing? Just say, the Lord needs it, and we'll send it back immediately. They went away, found the colt tied near the door outside the street, and they were untying it, and some of the bystanders came and said to them, what are you doing untying the colt? They told them what Jesus had said, and they let them take it. Then they brought the colt to Jesus and threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. And many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. Then those who went ahead and those who followed began shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest. Then Jesus entered Jerusalem and went into the temple. And when he had looked around at everything, as it was already late, he went out to Bethany with the 12. So a fairly simple telling. Other Gospels expand this event or give us more details. Here we get just one colt, not two as we see in other versions of the story. Most of this story, in fact, it's very interesting, most of the entry story is going to secure the animal. And the actual entry into Jerusalem story is only a few verses. And as people saw Jesus coming into Jerusalem, they began to sing and shout. Now, this is also in some ways a coronation story. This enacts the kind of parades that we might see possibly in Jerusalem, certainly in the Old Testament, but in the day of Jesus, we would expect to see things like this in Rome. And we would expect to see the one coming on a chariot or a horse or a golden carriage. And here Jesus rides a colt, a donkey, and the people shout out, and what they shout are verses tied to the expectation of the Messiah in the Jewish tradition. And it is a strange parade. It is a very humble coronation. But in the story, particularly from where the story goes from here, this is a pivotal moment.
And we've been building to it for some time now. If you look back on some of our previous lessons together, you're going to see the question of authority has been raised more often than it was in the past. The miracles have very much been focused on seeing Jesus for who he is. And now with this arrival in Jerusalem, you see very much this sort of messianic outpouring, this idea that he's arrived. And it's striking to me in verse 11, when he gets to Jerusalem, he went into the temple. And to my knowledge, I looked it up here, I don't think there's any other reference to the temple before this. This is the first time, I think, in Mark that we're told that Jesus has come to the temple. And that's significant. The messianic figure is the one who is very much going to restore King David's kingdom. I mean, this temple, of course, isn't the temple that King David made, but it in some ways is symbolic of that kingdom, the success of Israel of that time. And Jesus has now arrived. He's come, and yet he's done it in only the way that Jesus could do it, by reversing expectations. Instead of, like you said, Clint, coming in the massive show of force with a military entourage, Jesus shows up on the back of a colt with a crowd putting down some branches and shouting a hymn. You know, I think that's, for us, maybe that's an annual celebration that we have in worship, and so therefore might feel normal. I think, once again, if we were to sort of step back into the shoes of the ancients, this is a strange way for the king to arrive in Jerusalem.
Yeah, particularly when we already have gotten an inkling of what awaits Jesus in Jerusalem. The idea that Jesus, we could say, having the rest of the story, that Jesus is ultimately riding to victory. But in the context of where we are in this tale, Jesus is riding to his death. Jesus is going to that place, Jerusalem, knowing what is going to happen. And when he looks around, when he wanders Jerusalem in the dark, it is with that sort of ominous foreshadowing for Mark of knowing that the coming days are numbered for Jesus, that literally his time on earth is short, and that the last of his days are going to be, there's going to be suffering, there's going to be pain, and that hangs over this part of the story, I think.
This is the kind of story that inspires the most confidence for me in the scriptural texts. And what the reason for that, just to be honest with you, is this is not a very good celebration story for Jesus. I mean, Jesus has just arrived at the seat of power. And if I was going to work on concocting a religion, this is not the story that I would tell. It would have a lot more people. It would spend a lot more time talking about the grandeur of Jesus. There's something really authentic and compelling about a gospel writer like Mark, who is not fixated on external human measures of greatness. He just has no interest in it. He's not competing with anybody to show that Jesus is the strongest, the fastest, the most intelligent. He doesn't need to. Jesus is the Son of God. His authority is unquestionable. What he does and says is not human wisdom. It is divine. It is spectacular. It's amazing. It's beyond description. How many times has Jesus astounded people in this book? And for me, Clint, this is the kind of story that inspires great confidence for me in faith, because there's no telling here that is really led to trick someone. There's a sense in which this is thoroughly honest, that Jesus arrives to celebration, but not the kind of celebration you would expect of the Messiah. And I think there's something deeply honest and faith-inspiring in that.
We will talk about this again when we get to the Good Friday text, but it's fascinating the way the gospel writers set this up. And if Mark is the earliest, then he may set the pattern for this, that Holy Week lives between and in some sense hinges on the cries of the people who on this Sunday sing out the songs of the Messiah. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom. And they think they know what that means. And the fact that they don't understand it is going to lead them to cry out very different things only a few days from now in the text as they'll shout for Jesus' death. And it's important, I think, to understand for the gospel writers, it's the same people. It's those who are attracted to the idea that Jesus is going to bring them something, but who can't be, but because they can't understand what it is that Jesus brings, they turn on him. And here, in some ways, for a Christian, clearly resurrection is the height of the Jesus story. In terms of Jesus' earthly story, this is probably the moment that is as good as it gets. The people are with him. They're singing the song. They have the right songs. They have the right idea, but they don't understand what it means, and so they're not going to be able to follow it through. And I think in that there is obviously a great deal of irony. There's also a great deal of humility and a great deal of conviction for how easy it is to celebrate Jesus when Jesus seems to be the one and do things the way we want, and how hard it is to understand what it means that Jesus is Jesus when he doesn't fit our expectations or when he calls us to things that we're not willing to give or do.
Yeah, and let's not forget, let's give Mark credit. This was masterfully written so that we would understand that. Mark has spared no ink in helping us see in story after story after story how often people hear Jesus' teaching and see his miracles and do not understand the significance of them. That has all been intentional, and it's all building. And those stories in their cumulative nature are the reason why we get to this story and we know what you just described. It's not on accident. We sometimes think of the Bible as containing simple stories. No, these were masterfully prepared so that we might see these themes when we get to Holy Week. The reason why this week is so pregnant with meaning is because you can only see it through the lens of the whole work. And we have to give credit to the arrangers and those who have given us the scriptures, because they've done a masterful job in helping us see that.
Right, and Mark's a short gospel, so this is more obvious perhaps in some of the longer gospels, but in Mark, it wouldn't be half. It would be maybe a third. It is fascinating that for all the gospel writers, the bulk of their content is devoted to the last week of Jesus' life. If you just look at the number of chapters and the events, what fills the pages proportionally is this last week. And that's true in Mark too. It's probably 16 chapters, and 5 of the 16 are going to be the end of Jesus' life from the last week on. So it's definitely a heavily weighted part of the story.
Well, join us tomorrow as we continue into the week.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon.
Take care.
Thank you for joining us for this daily Bible study. If this is your first time, welcome. We are so glad that you have joined us for this time of intentional study of God's Word. You will find in the description of this video a link to our website. We would love to get to know who you are. We'd love to reach out and greet you personally. But be sure, whether or not this is your first time, to like this video. If you're on Facebook, share it so that other people might be able to find it too. If you're on YouTube, consider subscribing. You'll receive more content like this every day at 2 o'clock Central Standard Time. On top of that, every Wednesday at 9 o'clock, we release a Pastor Talk podcast, which goes through different series, but all of them about faith and life and discipleship of Jesus Christ. Friends, regardless of how many times you've been with us, we hope that this day has been meaningful for you as you seek to follow Jesus Christ. So until next time, be blessed. We look forward to seeing you soon.